Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany and some of its Axis allies during World War II. It started on June 22, 1941. It was the largest military invasion in human history, with more than 3 million men attacking along an 1,800-mile front. The code name was a tribute to Frederick I, a German king and Holy Roman Emperor who had led a crusade to the east in the 12th century.
Welcome, everybody, to the Noisy Reality Seminar on Operation Barbarossa, a 21st century look at June 22nd, 1941. Throughout these seminars, we will explore the planning and implementation of the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Third Reich and its allies on June 22nd, 1941. Today, we have the great pleasure to have with us Professor Ilya Grinberg of SUNY Buffalo State University. He's the co-author of Red Phoenix Rising, the Soviet Air Force in World War II, that he did with von Hardesty and Ilya Grinberg. This is that was a sort of a remake, if you will, or revision of what von Hardesty had done before. Now, Ilya is quite qualified to talk about, in a technical sense, aircraft. He's the SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor and Director of Electrical Engineering Technology in the Engineering Technology Department at SUNY Buffalo State. He holds a degree equivalent to a PhD in electronical engineering from Moscow State University that he received in 1993, and the qualification of an electrical engineer from the National University Lviv Polytech in 1979 from Lviv, Ukraine. His interests include design automation, systems engineering, power systems, smart grid, and microgrids. He teaches undergraduate courses and laboratories in power systems. He established state-of-the-art joint Buffalo State University at Buffalo Smart Grid Laboratory, of which he is the director. And he served on numerous scholarly endeavors that relate to this field. He's also a recognized scholar and author in World War II military history. The book he co-authored, Red Phoenix Rising, the Soviet Air Force in World War II, was named an outstanding academic title by the Choice magazine. And as I mentioned, we're going to be having Ilya today talk about the Red Air Force. He'll be doing a much broader look at it, but I will turn it over to Ilya. Thank you so much, Ilya, for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. And since we live in 2024, I decided to concentrate on operations of 1944 because it's 80 years old. 10 years ago, in 2014, I was at the conference that was called 1944 70 years old, and that was held in Sandhurst in UK at Royal Military Academy. So that was a blast. That was a fantastic conference. And I just can't believe that 10 years just passed. And so many more interesting things coming up. One of the reviews of Red Phoenix Rising, written by a graduate student from some school in Canada, just really touched the nerve because he dismissively wrote, "Oh, the Russians won by sheer numbers." So, and I want to touch on that and why did that happen and why it was inevitable. I will certainly also talk about the first days of Barbarossa, so we are not too far from the subject, from the topic of today's discussion. All right, so you can see a very nice picture of the Russian guy who is holding a bomb, and the inscription says, "The gift to Hitler." I love this image, very nice. Anyways, okay, so what do I do here? Right. Okay, here we go. The Soviet-German War, 1941-45, began with an awesome display of air power. And we know from literature and from last presentation by Ray what happened on June 24 from Luftwaffe perspective. The Soviet losses at 3,922 aircraft lost by the second day, with only 78 German planes lost. Remarkably, my numbers are exact match to Ukraine, which is pretty interesting. So you can see this image. I'm also very impressed by the one with Hitler, Goering, and Kesselring. They are pretty happy about what happened. And we know this image of destruction on Soviet airfields. Actually, when the numbers of destruction became available, Hitler ordered a reduction of production of aircraft. They thought they are done. They don't need as many. However, if we transport ourselves to 1944, also same period, May, June, Sevastopol, we encounter another image, quite a bit of reverse. So nothing is permanent. Okay. So I'm trying to advance and it's happening. Okay, here we go. So now the first image is from 1941, which is pretty familiar to all of us. And the second is not as much for many complicated reasons. Western accounts of World War II dealing with the theme of air power just conveniently forget this important episode. So, general air strategy and limited air strategy, two different aspects of perceptions of air power in the West and in the East. A general air strategy or strategic warfare, air warfare, that's Anglo-American practice emphasized strategic bombing and the destruction of war industries, oil refineries, railway junctions, population centers to hasten an end to the war. While limited air strategy or tactical air support for ground forces, that was a typical mindset for the Soviet Union and Germany. And the critical role of air power was understood in the context of combined arms warfare. Soviet air doctrine in pre-war years was not really that apparent. So let me go with something here that I would like to share with you. Give me just 1 second. All right, here we go. So, air tactic doctrine. What did they think about that, the Soviets? It was in the fluid state without a clear focus, failing to reflect operational and strategic significance of the air power. There was no settled sense of air theory in place in 1941 to provide a baseline for organization, operations, or training. In fact, there had been a shift in emphasis from bombers to fighters and ground attack aircraft designs, but this critical redefinition of priorities had not been properly translated into a functional air doctrine. At the meeting of top aviation and army commanders on December 23rd to 31st of 1940, this famous conference, often conflicting positions were voiced about the optimal organizational structure, centralization of command and control, methods of achieving air superiority, efficiency of airstrikes at enemy airfields, and coordination of aviation with ground forces. Even recent lessons of combat operations in Europe were interpreted differently. I would like to remind all of you, and you probably know this better than I do, that the two major points of the Soviet military doctrine was deep operations at the front level and the army level. So front level, 400 kilometers penetration, army level, around 100 kilometers. So they put a lot of thinking into these concepts. And there is no wonder that organization of the air power was divided between army level and the front level, or group of armies level. And obviously, there were air assets in the form of mixed air divisions that had several bomber regiments, several fighter regiments, principally subordinated to the army commanders, and mostly bomber assets subordinated to the front commanders, clearly to provide operational breakthroughs. So talks at this conference in favor of centralization, but still allows forces for tactical ground commanders. Obviously, lack of communications and coordination that led to decentralization and prevented concentration of forces was pretty obvious. So several opinions voiced during this conference. There were talks in favor of centralization, but still allowing forces for tactical ground commanders, to allocate forces to tactical ground commanders. Obviously, the lack of communications prevents coordination. That would not work at all. They didn't understand it. One of the presenters pointed to two major functions of air power. Achieving air superiority, obviously. Who would argue against that? But his thoughts were air superiority must be provided on all fronts at the same time. Otherwise, it will lead to temporary superiority at one or another sector and could be lost within days. Air war is not an air operation. It is a war consisting of series of operations, including destruction of aviation on airfields and in the air, destruction of oil wells, fuel storage facilities, and refineries, destruction of aviation industry. It requires having qualitative and quantitative superiority. So that is the thinking at the end of 1940. And then the second item that he mentioned is support of ground troops, which means subordination of aviation and its tasks to ground commanders and decentralization. I will touch on some of these points in a few minutes. Another opinion was that main task of aviation is support of ground forces. All tasks of aviation in front operations are dictated by the needs of the front. That includes cover of ground troops, reconnaissance. Air superiority must be achieved simultaneously with cover of ground forces, which is determined by active struggle for air superiority. Issue of centralization must have full unified control to assume maneuver of air assets at decisive moments. Need to develop airfield network as one of important aspects of air superiority. Disbelief of heavy losses of aircraft on the airfields in France. That was based on their own experience during the wars in Spain, Falkengol, and China. Many of them said, no, this is like the journalists invented these numbers. We cannot seriously believe them. This is not possible to lose 500 aircraft in one day at the airfields. How wrong they were. Air assets must be concentrated and centralized at army commander, not corps commander level. So just, who controls what? It's impossible to achieve strategic air superiority over an entire country for enemy that is equal in strength, but only over specific areas and at certain time. Only coordination of all forces under the command of ground commanders at the army and front level will decide success of an operation and the war. Therefore, the place of aviation is only in combined arms, battles, and operations. So it was another opinion that centralization of German aviation, where even army groups do not have air forces, that was their thinking. Under their command, was a mistake. Such rigid centralization is wrong. Therefore, main command must have 9 to 12 air divisions, while armies and groups of armies must have the main forces of aviation. They mentioned that it was incorrect to split aviation below army command level. Another opinion was to distribute aviation to mobile army formations, such as mechanized or cavalry corps, that requires even more decentralization. Achieving air superiority should be in the area of ground operations, not the entire country and the entire theater. Supports subordination to front and army commands, although endorses concentration and coordination. So there are conflicting opinions. I just wanted to make a comment that one of the presenters mentions air superiority and such important things as destruction of aviation on airfields and in the air, destruction of oil industries, suppression of aviation and destruction of aviation industry, quantitative, qualitative superiority. Clearly, the Soviets didn't have that. And if you look at, in retrospect, it becomes pretty obvious that only allies combined could achieve that. With the Anglo-American air forces, with their strategic understanding of strategic strategy, air strategy, were able to do this part, while the Soviets were proficient, especially by the end of the war, in the air superiority over the battlefield, covering their forces and mobile units. So only together. None of them could do it alone. That's my point. All right, let me move forward. Then, of course, rapid expansion of air power, creation of new air regiments, lagging in training, lagging in quality and quantity of production, lagging in construction of airfields, thus limiting the maneuver of aviation assets at the very early stages of the war, contributed to the drastic and tragic events. So lessons of the first period of the war were learned. There were some elements of centralization of air assets. In 1942, air armies were created. However, they were not really mobile units. They still were subordinated to the front commanders. At least they removed the army level command, and that was pretty important. So as I said, changes are coming, and these 18 air armies that were created in 42 mushroomed from 200 aircraft in each to 2,500 aircraft. Pretty dramatic expansion. The changes are coming. It became clear to all aviation and ground force commanders of the Red Army that on the concentrated actions of aviation on the narrow sectors of the front lines, coordinated in time and space with the actions of the ground troops, would provide substantial results. Of course, this all came as a result of painful lessons of the first period of the war. And finally, they started to create air corps of high command reserve. They were true mobile units. They were moved from the sector to sector when they were most needed, while the air armies still stayed fairly static, subordinated to their fronts. So let me talk about numerical superiority. In typical condition of the first period of the war, average density of ground attack aircraft was 4, 5 Ilyushin Il-2s for 1 kilometer of the front at the breakthrough conditions, at the breakthrough corridors, rather. Based on the capabilities of bomber tactical aviations and artillery, the ground attack aviation would have to suppress at least 5% of the target for every 1 kilometer of the front. So we are looking at fairly low densities. They are not capable of solving the problem. And something had to be done. Not enough aircraft, especially ground attack aircraft. In fact, Sturmovix were capable only of destruction of not more than 1% of all targets. And I just mentioned that at least 5% were required to do that. So combined arms armies suffered heavy losses, and advances in tactical breakthroughs at that time were on average from 2 to 4 kilometers per day. What does it mean? So it means that we are talking about static conditions of the front. Mobile operations are denied because the enemy can plug the holes by moving reserves from less threatened sectors of the front. Now, during the final operations of the war, the VVS, or Soviet Air Force, their tactics changed and provide conditions for drastic increases of air power. So final operations of the war, the density per 1 kilometer of the front, 3 to 4 times higher for troops concentrations, 6 to 10 times in artillery, 8 to 10 times in armor, 2 to 2.5 times in air defense concentrations. So how to defeat that? So of course, you need numbers. You need numbers, you need numbers. So let's see what is happening now. Now the density of Il-2s for 1 kilometer of the front increased 6 to 7 times compared to the beginning of the war, and now comprised 30 to 35 aircraft, in some cases 60 to 80 aircraft per 1 kilometer. That's a substantial punch. So now that allows you to provide uninterrupted influence over the battlefield. This is an extension of artillery. So the Sturmovix and the air assets were able to pinpoint the targets that were not destroyed and effectively suppress them when they could, of course. So once again, the numerical superiority is being called by the necessity of uninterrupted influence on the enemy over the battlefield. Obviously, importance of air cover of mobile groups. Typically, one tank army would be supported by 1 bomber, 1 ground attack, and 2 fighter air corps. 10 corps would be supported by 1 fighter and 1 ground attack division or corps. And with this in mind, such high densities allowed reliable suppression and destruction of enemy targets at all stages of offensive operation, and assures that at that time that the breakthroughs would be on average 8 to 15 kilometers per day, which made it impossible to fend Red Army blows by deploying reserves and shifting troops from less threatened axes. So it's pretty clear that from these perspectives, numerical superiority is a necessity. Now, numerical superiority in terms of technical specification of the aircraft. Now, in this case, what are we having here? We are having that the Lend-Lease supplied A-20 Boston or Havoc bomber aircraft had a payload and range twice as great as the Soviet-built Tetlakov PE-2 bomber. One division of A-20 bombers is essentially equivalent to 2 divisions of PE-2 bombers. That means that we are talking about quantity of fighter escorts, basing requirements, logistics, etc. So now you have domestically produced bombers, PE-2s, that you need much larger number of them to develop the same payload as Junkers 88 will deliver to the opposing side. And it requires tremendous resources in terms of fuel, basing capabilities, escorts, and so forth. However, the number of PE-2s was not adequate. So how would you substitute that? You would substitute that with the use of ground attack Ilyushin Il-2 in the duties of frontal bombers or tactical bombers. So not just as ground attack, but they were actually, it was an order of Stalin to deploy them as tactical bombers. All right, so let's see what happens now with an opposing side. The Junkers 88A4 has a payload of 3,100 pounds internally and up to 6,600 pounds externally. A PE-2 bomber typical payload was from 1,700 to 2,100 pounds. So it's about 3 times less. Il-2 payload was limited to 300 kilograms, so 800 pounds. Otherwise, it will just disintegrate in the air. It would not be able to fly. The quality of production was pretty low at that time. We are talking 43, 44. So it couldn't even fly. It couldn't even take off with more than 300. It was limited to 300. PE-2, that's a separate story. Everybody thinks that's a dive bomber. It is precise. Well, not really. And the problem is, it was designed as a high-speed, high-altitude fighter. It was hastily reworked as a tactical bomber by the order of Stalin in 1940. It didn't even pass acceptance tests and was ordered in production. However, as you can imagine, that the profile of its wing, designed for high-speed, high-altitude fighter function, was not adequate for the operations of tactical bombing. It would stall on landing and takeoff. It would require pretty high level of competency and training of its crews. It would be extremely difficult to fly on a single engine if another one is damaged. Numerous accidents and losses due to stalling. So it killed probably more crews in accidents than in action. And I will talk about that in a few minutes. Now, speaking of dive bombing, they could barely fly at level missions, at level bombing missions. Only few individual crews were capable of providing dive bombing operations, but they were in the vast minority. So now, speaking of the fighter airplanes, higher power output of Luftwaffe fighter resulted in their ability of effective vertical maneuver. They could, and that was shown on the Western Front during defense of Prague. The Soviet fighters, their performance at higher altitudes was limited because of the low output of their engines, not enough. So obviously, how would you fend the capable Luftwaffe Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs? The quantity. So you put them at several levels, echeloning them at several levels. So now the Messerschmitt, for example, goes up in vertical maneuver, is fended by another group, like 2 or 4 Soviet fighters at higher altitudes. Then, you go up again, there is another pair waiting for you over there. So once again, at least 3 to 1 in order to gain the parity with more technically and tactically superior Luftwaffe operations. So it's, nothing you can do about it. You have to have numerical superiority based on the technical, and tactical realities of the Soviet Union. So now, as I mentioned, we are moving to 1944, and by that time, it's a peak might with inventory of 13,936 combat aircraft. Becomes the largest operational tactical air force in the world. So let's say the number of bombers in January 1st, 1944, 2,900. June 1st, 3,146. January 1st, 1945, 3,220. So roughly, slight increase. Ground attack aircraft, 2,413, 3,797, 4,171 by January 1st, 1945. Once again, emphasis is on close air support of advancing armies and corps deep into the enemy territory. Fighter aircraft from 3,900 to 5,800. So once again, just big emphasis on that, and compare that with a fairly steady number of bomber aircraft. So the whole point is ground attackers and fighters. That's where the money was invested. That's where the resources were invested. They did not have enough resources to build more bombers. Much more laborious, and material like aluminum was not enough to do that. Okay, let's move on. Now, by 1944, the Soviet Air Force, now organized into highly mobile and mushrooming air armies, performed 153,545 combat sorties just during Bagration or Belarusian offensive operation, June 23 to August 29, 1950. Now, if you will compare that with 91,000 sorties during Berlin operation, it becomes pretty clear that, the display of air power in the summer of 1944 was absolutely stunning. Now, the total number of sorties of the Soviet aviation in 1944 amounted to 817,064 sorties, which is pretty incredible. So they are getting, the upper hand on air superiority, but again, over the battlefield, Not across the entire front, though. Still not across the entire front. They are not still getting air supremacy. Now, it would be quite interesting to see what tasks the Soviet Air Force performed during the war. I highlighted in yellow the most, the emphasis that they had on their operations. So ground strikes against enemy targets. In 1941, it's 44, almost 45%. In 42, 51%. In 43, 45.5%. In 44, 39, almost 40%. In 45, 53%. In 41, we are talking about the period from June 22nd, and 45, the period until May 9th. So that's not entire year. However, the strikes on the airfield, it's only 2.5, 3%, 2%, 1.5%. Okay, so absolutely not enough attention to that, because these were not a simple operations. They were costly. They attempted to have air operations against enemy airfields. They were not very successful. They were disastrous, in fact. Strikes on railroads, 4% essentially, 5.5%, almost 4%, 1.34, 38. Strikes on storage facilities in 44.13%. The data for 41 to 43 is not listed, so I presume it was insignificant. Strikes on ports, river crossings, bridges, and ships, just, 1.2, a fraction of a percent, 1%. Absolutely not enough. Cover of own troops and facilities in the rear. Now that's a significant increase. So that's almost 31% in 41, 19% in 42, 16% in 43, 14 in 44, and 11 in the first half of 1945. Intercept of enemy aircraft, insignificant number of sorties. Pre-hunt missions over enemy territory, a fraction. Escort of other types of aviation, that's where the resources are moved, so that's 8.6, 14, 18, almost 19% of all the sorties. Artillery spotting missions, just a fraction. Special assignments, transport missions, aerial reconnaissance. And by aerial reconnaissance, this is not the case of specially equipped aircraft. In many cases, it was just visual. So several crews in like regular bomber or fighter regiments would fly just to visually identify where the enemy is. There were several, what I call them famous regiments like 48 and 49, mighty 48 and mighty 49 reconnaissance regiments. They were acting under subordination of Supreme Command. So they were not even subordinated to the front, to the air armies. They were detached separate units. They had photographic equipment as well as visual reconnaissance missions. So overall, we can see the number of sorties per year and how it mushroomed from 269,000 and a half to 569,000 in 45, in the first half of 45, 817,000 sorties in 1944. Quite substantial. Now, numerical superiority, once again, in the context of command and control. So now, by 1944, the coordination of ground attack units with fighter escorts and improvements in tactics of EU2 utilization reached the level of mastery. And same is true for other types of aviation. they learned their lessons. Germans were excellent teachers, and commanders started to master radio vectoring stations, and they got solid training for using radio and targeting their air assets. Front air observers were assigned to frontline units for proper targeting and coordination. So that is a significant technological breakthrough, because as I always say, that the Soviet Air Forces, it's a huge organization. You can see that by numbers. And changes in large organizations are always difficult. They take time. And just in short 2.5 years, they were able to master the techniques, new technology, and command and control. That was pretty remarkable achievement. Was it 100% successful all the times? Of course not, but it made a difference. Right. Now, introduction and mastery of radio control, introduction and use of radars. Although radars were used literally from the first months of the war, but their quantities were quite limited. Now, more radio stations are coming, many of them land-lease, much more efficient and reliable. And that obviously changed the reality of air operations and allowed better targeting and better control over the air. And of course, radio. And I will never stop saying that without land-lease, without modern land-lease fighters like P-39s, with excellent radio communication capabilities, the vectoring stations, that, achievements of air superiority will not be possible. The Soviet aircraft were not equipped with quality radios. The wiring inside the aircraft was not properly insulated and grounded. So the noise was annoying. Many air crews just, abandoned the use of radio, especially in the first years, because it was useless for them. Now you're having high quality radio communication, allowing targeting, more efficient operations, and so forth. And of course, Air Marshal, Chief Marshal of Aviation, Alexander Novikov, was instrumental in providing these organizational and technological changes during the war under fire. And you see a picture of Novikov being on the cover of the Time magazine. Quite interesting. However, large numbers, large losses. And I want to emphasize the losses of Soviet aircraft over the years. And please pay attention to these numbers and see, let's see, 8,000 aircraft for VVS. We also have long-range aviation, which is separate, fighter aviation of air defense, of PVO, naval aviation. So total losses, 10,546 in 1941 from June 22nd. Non-combat losses, 7,354 during the same period. If we look at 1944, 9,456 losses, combat losses, 15,344 non-combat losses. So total losses in 1944, almost 25,000 aircraft. Unbelievable. These numbers are just stunning. Is that the price of a rapid expansion? In some respect, it is. Just once again, look at the losses in 1940, in 1944, 1945, and total losses 42,732 non-combat and 45,568 combat. So overall losses 88,300 aircraft during the 4 years period. Incredible numbers. So the asterisks here in 1944 numbers, I have conflicting numbers in two sources. Other numbers correlate within 100, 150. That's insignificant, but the number of losses in 1942 differs from different sources, in different sources. So I just put an asterisk here. Now, how these losses did occur? Over 50% of losses are non-combat losses, attributed to poor training program, reduced number of training hours, difficulties in transitioning to new hardware, low discipline of crews and commanding officers, poor manufacturing quality, deficiencies in aircraft and engines design, poor quality of fuel and the lubricants. Infrastructure is lagging the quantitative growth. Fuel is the bottleneck, not enough fuel for training flights in combat units. So how would you distribute fuel? So fuel is limited. The volume of its production didn't change dramatically. In fact, a lot of reliance was on Lend-Lease supplies of 100-octane fuel. What the Russians did, they didn't have even industrial capacity to produce such a high-quality fuel. So they just mixed. The US supplied gas with what they did and to boost performance. Otherwise, they had to derate the boost of their engines if the proper octane number of gas was not available. So now the fuel is distributed to the units who are fighting and who are productive. What about the rest of them? Not enough. Not enough even for training sorties. So you're having the new freshly minted pilots from the flight school with roughly 20 hours behind their belt. They can't shoot, they can't bomb. They probably had one bombing exercise in good weather from level flight. They are sent to the frontline units with, see you there, they will teach you at the unit level. Well, they are coming to the unit level. There is not enough fuel, so the training is greatly degraded. And when the time comes, they are thrown into the battle and die. And lucky they are if they survive 5 sorties. Those who survive 10 would become highly productive pilots, aces, and so forth. So that was the reality. So you have large numbers. Not all of these numbers are actually deployed properly. So you can sit for a couple of months with no action, and then you have a Luftwaffe group and thrown to this sector of the front. They just saw intense battles. They are eager to fight. They are highly trained. They are motivated, and they meet the kids who were sitting without proper training. And, you know, the results are pretty clear. In fact, the ratio of losses in 1943, 10 to 1. 1944, 45, roughly 5 to 1. Despite the mastery, despite all the advances, it still didn't work that well. Okay. So now the tactics, the poor, improper, passive tactics of constant air patrols. which is essentially a clear disadvantage as it gives initiative to the enemy. The Soviet aviators bitterly called their own actions as achieving air supremacy or air superiority following the schedule. So permanent patrols associated with high intensity of resources, large fuel consumption, engine hours. But once again, infantry would demand that. They would feel more comfortable if they have constant air cover above their heads. But much higher efficiency could be achieved if the intercept techniques would be employed, especially with the aid of radars, as well as the actions of охотники, that's free hunters. But as you could see, the number of sorties for free hunt was very, very limited. All right, then what else do we have here? So these inefficient patrol methods have to be continued during the entire war to bring moral satisfaction to ground troops. So problems with airfields during rapid advances, not enough. Like 1944, basically the units were competing who will occupy the airfield. Some airfields would be taken even during the battle to clear the area. Lack of discipline, that's enduring problem in the Soviet aviation, very low discipline. Breaking formation, chasing other targets, loss of command and control, weak radio discipline, poor navigational skills. So that all were the factors that persisted not just in 1941, but throughout the years. Pretty incredible. So, in summary, application of ever-increasing Soviet air power, deployed in tactical role, greatly assisted advancing Red Army and transformed tactical successes into operational ones with strategic consequences. And as Richard Overy mentioned, it's a clear case of winning battles through the possession of huge resources rather than through the efficient use of those resources. But as I mentioned, it's inevitable. It would be impossible to operate with less numbers. As I said, the payload of the aircraft, the caliber of the bomb load. So how would you deliver the same punch on the enemy if your bomber aircraft are limited in range, especially in payload? They cannot even carry 500-kilogram bombs or 1,000-pound bombs, okay? So for that, you need significantly higher numbers to deliver the same effect as you are getting from the other side. And this is the cover of One in Mine book. A lot is written there. And I just touched bases on some basic things in 41 and moved to 44 because it's just the 80 years. And I really wanted to explain the necessity of numerical superiority in terms of uninterrupted influence over the battlefield, the technical characteristics of the aircraft, the command and control structure existing at that time, overall technological literacy of the nation, poor manufacturing quality, large amount of losses that had to be compensated. So these are a couple of things. I also wanted to show you or illustrate I will go back to 1941, actually, end of June, and illustrate the chaos and disarray that was experienced by the Soviets. They were pretty desperate to put everything they could. Yes, they lost quite stunning number of aircraft in the first week of the hostilities. However, the number of pilots, they still had enough. Okay, they had enough aircraft, although pretty outdated, but enough to continue fighting. And they had enough pilots, unlike the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain. So that not everything was lost, but the lack of discipline, the lack of command and control, broken communications created substantial chaos at operational units. So I'm pretty stunned with an example that I read, and it is also mentioned in Red Phoenix Rising. The Soviets formed 3 special purposes fighter regiments with the crews from test pilots. Highly experienced, very proficient, they could fly anything. So they sent one of their engineers to the Pskov region, that's in northern sector of the front, to inspect the air base for their operations. Right, so the name of the engineer was Major Statnik. He ordered the PS-84 transport aircraft. That's the licensed copy of DC-3. They called it Douglas. And on final approach to the airfield, they could not lower the plane's landing gear. So they decided to circle the airfield to manually retract the gear. It didn't work very well because they were shot at from the ground by their own forces, despite the red stars on the wings. Then the MiG took off and started shooting at them in the air. With no landing gear, they barely landed on the airfield, and the commanding officer of the unit at the airfield, Colonel Toropchin, air division commander and the hero of the Soviet Union, arrived at the airfield just prior to the crash landing. He observed the event with anger and frustration and claimed that all the fools circling around the airfield have to and will be shot down. He mentioned that he did not receive a warning that this airplane is coming, and the loss of communication obviously created a serious crisis. In the meantime, the patrolling flight of MiG-3s landed. No sooner that they had touched down than a group of Dornier bombers suddenly attacked the train station nearby at low altitude, scoring a number of direct hits. Several MiG and I-153 fighters rose to make a belated response. But this counterattack took place some 6-7 minutes after the enemy bombers had departed. In the aftermath of the raid, and in response to the many calamities of the day, the local commander, Major General Kutsavalov, ordered Toropchin to muster the entire base personnel for a dressing down. This angry critique lasted for an hour. That meant pulling all the personnel off duty to be reprimanded. Unbelievable. On the same day, another Douglas and SB bomber, and by the way, don't call it SB-2, it's SB. The number 2 stands SB 2M100 or M103. So 2 engines M100 or 103. It's not the designation SB2. It's SB 2M100. Okay, just SB. So another Douglas and SB were fired upon from the ground by their own forces. In the evening, 2 MiG-3s and 2 I-153s took off following a flare signal towards approaching twin-engine aerial target. Upon return, one of the pilots reported that an enemy Heinkel 111 had been down. General Kutsevalov immediately went to inspect the site, only to find out that it was their own DB-3F bomber returning from reconnaissance mission. At 0200 hours on July 1st, Dornier 215 swept over the field 3 times, dropping illumination bombs. One I-153 fighter rose to intercept the Dornier, but failed to make contact. Then on the morning of July 2nd, 2 Dornier 215 bombed the airfield despite a low overcast, dropping bombs from 3 to 400 feet. At the time of the attack, patrolling fighters had failed to detect them. Moreover, there was no alert or guidance from the ground. Subsequent German attacks over the next few days inflicted serious damage. The German raids passed with no effective response by the local defenses. There had been a systematic failure to identify the enemy and react effectively. This episode mirrored the chaos that existed at isolated Soviet air base in the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa. Sporadic action over the airfield persisted from July 1st to 5th, with MiG-3 and I-153 fighters scrambling to challenge attacking enemy aircraft. Often, VVS aircraft stationed at the airfield ranged out as far as Veliki Luki on patrols. On occasion, German bombers stealthily used cloud formations to shield attacks. At the nearby rail station, patrolling Soviet fighters missed 2 low-flying German aircraft, which had managed to reach their target and hastily retreat. On the night of July 4th, the airfield faced an attack by Heinkel 111 bombers. One defending MiG-3 fell under friendly fire from the ground and was forced to make an emergency landing. The attacking Heinkel 111s escaped. 4 MiG-3s and 1 U-2 aircraft were burned on the ground. One bright moment came when Captain Bakhchivanji, again another test pilot, famous for flying the rocket plane B-1, shot down one enemy aircraft, returning unhurt despite the loss of his aircraft. Of the 23 MiG-3 fighters at the airfield, only 7 remained operational at the close of the July 4th, 1941 day. On the following day, 2 Bf-109s strafed the field, making 9 passes. Despite a clear signal for takeoff, none of the available MiGs and I-153s managed to get airborne to intercept the enemy aircraft. As an after-action summary, the report looks critically at the performance of air and ground personnel during the 5-day assault on the beleaguered airfield near Pskov. I just want to re-emphasize 5 days over the same airfield. What a chaos. Which only added to combat efficiency of the Luftwaffe fighters and bomber crews. The gap in experience and techniques was obvious. Situation where the heroism and determinism of the defenders was not in itself adequate to stand the tide. On certain occasions, for example, in the defense of a nearby rail station, the anti-aircraft batteries had failed to act. Frequently, command points had functioned awkwardly, as in the case of radio communications. This new and critical tool, even if not widely used, was nevertheless rarely exploited as a way of organizing defenses. There were moments where stupidity prevailed, as in the one case where a command point sounded an alarm with a rocket when they spotted a flock of geese at 200,000 meters. Too often, there was no debriefing of air crews, which allowed mistakes to continue unabated. This near total loss of command and control created a situation where functional command fell to even rank-and-file pilots. There was one instance where a regimental engineer fired flares to launch a flight of interceptors when the enemy was supposedly spotted by him near the airfield. and that was what he thought was an enemy. So just to emphasize the chaos of situation, and that is not June 22nd. That's already July, 5 days in July. So there is no surprises, but total loss of control, command, communications, low discipline, just incredible. I just read several orders and decrees by the People's Commissar of Defense for several years, from 37 to 41, from Voroshilov to Tymoshenko, and essentially repeating the same motives, the same themes every year. What has to be done? What has to be done? What has to be done? Low discipline. So the order stated low discipline, that is intolerable, ordering marching exercises for 6 hours a week, 2 days, 3 hours each on the plots, okay, for pilots and ground crews. That's how they tried to correct the discipline, marching on the plots like an infantry. Oh, well, I will be happy to entertain questions.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Ilya. Wow. What a tour de force.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let folks, raise their hands. And I'm going to just ask the first question. And I know that to answer this probably would take like 5 sessions. But I just was curious, how were they absorbing these lessons immediately after the war in terms of how they're constructing the Red Air Force in light of the introduction of atomic weapons, et cetera? I mean, I know that it would take, literally, as I say, several discussions in depth along the lines of what you're saying. But what kind of lessons are they drawing from these experiences immediately after World War II, the Red Air Force?
Well, great question. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. So first of all, by May 9th, 1945, the Soviet Air Forces, and by Air Forces, it's just the Air Force or VVS, plus air defense, naval aviation. Long-range aviation already by that time was subordinated to the Air Force. So they ended the war as the largest operational tactical Air Force in the world. And in August, after the detonation of nuclear weapon, it all became obsolete overnight. They did not have any strategic air arm. Their doctrine and their industrial capacity actually did not allow them to have it. They asked repeatedly the Allies, especially the US, to provide them B-17s, but the answer was obviously no. And pretty obviously why. There are many reasons why it was no. First of all, how would you use it? You have no infrastructure for that to base them. You have no doctrine. You would use them in tactical role and suffer tremendous losses. So the answer was absolutely no. So now the industry is, the aviation industry is not very much proficient in building all metal airplanes. Only PE-2s and Tupolev Tu-2s were built from aluminum. So they are not ready for mass production. They are not ready for any operational deployment. And they lack the strategic arm. We know they are frantically working on their own atomic weapon, but there is no delivery mechanism. As you all know, in 1944, the B-29s from Saipan, I believe, or from one of the Pacific Islands, during their bombing raids of Japan, were shot down or were fired at. They sustained some damage, and 3 of them had no way to return back, so they force landed in the Soviet Far East and were obviously interned. Their crews were interned and secretly moved to the camps in Central Asia, and once again secretly returned to the United States, making almost around the world trip, because the Soviet Union still had the treaty with Japan, so they were not at war. And for Stalin, that was a godsend gift. They really called it a gift from God. He ordered immediately to copy B-29. So they ferried one of them, actually all of them, to Moscow. And Tupolev was charged of making exact copy of it. This is really a very interesting story, because they were able to copy and start production of an analog, which was called TU4, Tupolev 4, which was, some people will call it a copy. I would call it an analog, because they had to redesign the whole thing using metric system, okay? And by using metric system, you cannot actually make exactly the same thickness of air plates, of metal plates. So it's either less or higher, small, like thinner or thicker, right? If you are going thinner, you are losing in rigidity, in structural rigidity. If you are going thicker, you are paying weight penalty. Same thing with wiring. So the gauges are different. So if you are making a high gauge in metric system, it's a weight penalty. Lower, you're facing voltage drops. So they redesigned the whole airframe. It was interesting that the order was direct copy, and the secret police people were actually watching for that. So God forbids you to do something what you want to do. So no deviations, no changes were allowed. Although they were made, okay, so for example, the general who was in charge of equipping plane with radio equipment wanted a better radio station that was available from B-25s that were supplied to the Soviets, 870 of them. But the radio station that was installed on that specific B-29 was not as advanced. So the guy who is in charge of production says, I cannot do that. I'm not allowed. So they secretly kind of made a deal. So you, on paper, you just mentioned that you use exactly the same thing, but in fact, you put more advanced stuff. Or it was a bullet hole. So they replicated the round opening exactly as it was. One part of the bomb bay was painted, another one was not. So they did exactly the same thing. The ashtrays on the B-29 in the cockpit, they just welded them. They duplicated the ashtrays and they welded them because they were not allowed to smoke in flight. So things like that. So now in 2 years, you are dragging and elevating the technological level of the entire industry, of the entire industrial base of the country to the level that they did not possess. And this is pretty remarkable achievement in 2 years. Like avionics, the manufacturing, and all these things where the foundation of creating MiG-15s, U-16s, Illusion 28s, because now you are getting your hand on technologies, on methods and materials that they did not have before. And this is, by the way, one of the incredible outcomes of Lend-Lease, because now how many people are exposed to that technology? It's not just few engineers and few designers. It's rank and file. It's technicians and crew chiefs in the field that have access to new technologies, new materials, new technological solutions, I would say. So now you are having a more prepared workforce and force generally to deal with something more modern that you didn't have possession of.
Well, thank you so much, Ilya. It gives me ideas to have you talk about this in greater depth another time. Go on, Joe.
Okay, so thank you. That was a great talk. I do have one question. Could you elaborate a little bit on how you got your numbers? I mean, everybody lies as far as, losses. And for the Soviets to admit they had so many technical losses, did they actually say that?
Yes, they did. I am in possession of the extremely useful document, which is called the Soviet Air Forces in Numbers, 1941-1945. Published by the main directorate of the Air Forces in the 50s. So they collected all the statistics. I have everything, the number of sorties, number of losses, production numbers, numbers of people that they graduated from flight schools and technical schools and so forth. It's an amazing document. The only thing that is missing, they do not list the losses or non-combat losses for specific types of aircraft. So for example, I'm pretty interested in knowing how many non-combat losses compared to combat losses were encountered by PE2. So these numbers are not available. But the document itself, they talk about, all the statistics, not just overall, but by the periods, by the major operations. Okay, so how much and what are the numbers, for example, for the Battle of Moscow, or Battle for Stalingrad, or Kursk Battle, Battle of Berlin, and so forth. So statistics is available. Of course, it was classified, but declassified, definitely. So that's the foundation of the numbers. Another volume that they published, it was published by, edited by General Krivosheyev in the late 90s, I believe, or mid 90s. It's just specifically the volume dedicated to losses. So I'm comparing both sources, and that's why I found a discrepancy for 1942, because the volume of the Soviet Air Forces in numbers has more losses in 1942 than Krivosheyev's book. The rest were fairly like 100, 150 out of these tens of thousands. That's insignificant discrepancy.
You got some more, Joe?
This is available.
I'm good. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ilya. Go on, Frank.
Yes, thanks very much. Now, war is about the acquisition of strategic assets. It's a strange and it's a really odd anomaly that Germany and the Soviet Union both decided around the middle of the 30s not to engage in building strategic bombers. And they sort of mirror imaged each other during the war in that they only had not even very adept two-engine bombers. And it is odd that Germany moved its most sophisticated technological manufacturing to the east, as the Soviet was advancing. And it is also odd that no V2s, no V1s were ever fired at the Soviet Union. No Me-262s were ever fired at the Soviet Union, used against the Soviet Union. As far as I know, there may have been a couple of examples. But essentially, at the end of the day, it was possible for the Soviet Union to gain massive technology, technical innovations by capturing these plants in the East. And this strange situation where you've got both sides mirror imaging each other's strategies in the air war. And then, of course, you've got the odd situation where it seems that the Soviet Union and Germany cooperated over the airfield at Poltava in June of 1944, where, the B-17s lost about 40 of them. And that was an odd situation. And there was also reconnaissance planes shot down by the Soviet Union. So I think there's still a lot of questions out there as to what was in the mindsets and what was the motivation. I don't know if you got any thoughts about that.
I do have some thoughts. Obviously, the structure of the Luftwaffe, obviously, and that was the function of the aviation industry output. It's a blitzkrieg. So why do you need like a strategic force, strategic bomber, if you will not use it? There are no targets for the war in the West. In fact, I want to quote a phrase that I heard at this wonderful conference at Sunhurst. In the West, the armies are too big for a country. In the East, the country is too big for an army. That is pretty interesting. So now, facing, their drive to the east, so once again, the calculations are it would be done in a couple of weeks. Why do we need it? We don't need it. We don't need strategic air power. However, even in 1944, as you mentioned, the Germans successfully bombed Poltava Air Base, inflicting serious damage to B-17s. Around the same time, they bombed important factories in Gorky area and Saratov area, actually significantly hampering production of Yak-1 planes in Saratov aircraft factory and many important war time factories, war machine factories in Gorky and Perm. So they just burnt these many factories to ashes, and the Soviets barely recovered from that. Okay, so there were some capabilities, not as obvious, not as powerful as U.S. and U.S. Army Air Force and Royal Air Force in terms of strategic operations. But once again, it all starts with the 20s and 30s, with the mindsets. Britain and U.S. are separated from European mainland by water. And this is the only way, to project power is through the strategic air forces that have an independence, while the land-based powers such as Germany, Soviet Union, and other European powers, they concentrated their efforts in tactical insubordination to the army, subordination to the ground forces. More so for the Soviet Union, a little bit less for Germany. They still had a lot of freedom how to use and how to maneuver with their assets. And speaking of Poltava, I could probably do another 2 hours on that. Quite interesting stuff. very interesting things. I do have basically documents that were declassified, KGB archives, looking at, all the reports, what was happening, how they were monitoring the foreigners. They were okay with interactions between the Soviet personnel and Americans until they saw the magazines, the journals. Okay. And now, you don't want to expose your people to seeing how is life in the United States. So they started to separate them, not allowing things and so forth. In fact, by the way, after the disaster in June 1944 at Poltava, the Americans offered B-61s, the double trouble, the interceptors, radar-equipped interceptors for the Soviet air defenses. And the leadership of the Soviet Air Force was very open to acquire them. Stalin said no. Period. Because that would require more American boots on the ground. He declined. And of course, again, fiasco of detecting the German airplanes and poor coordination, poor reconnaissance. They did not deploy proper fighter assets to fend these attacks. So that's an incredible story by its own.
Wow. Yes. Thank you. Maybe we'll bring General Bulger in because Danny did his dissertation on Poltava at some point. Dan Bulger did it at the University of Chicago. Go on, Gary.
Hi. So thank you for your very interesting talk. I do have your book.
Thank you.
And matter of fact, I was just looking at it a few months ago with respect to the narrative around the Battle of Kursk. And specifically why that is because recently I put together a database of all of the German fighter pilots that had 60 or more victories, of which there was an incredible 230. And about a little over half were killed during the war. But I happened to be able to put up together, the month, the date that they became a casualty or were killed. Most of them were killed. A few were POWs, and also where approximately. And it turns out by far the biggest month of losses amongst that group. Again, this is the expert in 60 or more victories, Luftwaffe fighter pilots. The biggest loss month for them was not in the months running up to D-Day, as we're likely to believe, based upon the historiography in the West, but is in July of 1943. There's 11 are killed in that month, of which 8 are on the Eastern Front. Now, I don't know how some of these could have been by ground fire. Maybe a lot of them are ground fire. I really don't know. But that's by far the largest month. The next largest month is 6, which is like 5 months that had 6. And one of them happens to be the next month, August of 1943, all of which were on the Eastern Front. So, and by comparison, in the 3 months prior to D-Day, and in the West or over the Reich, there were exactly 5 in every month killed. So I feel like that's just a dimension. And if you look at the German fighter force, globally, their peak strength was on the eve of the Battle of Kursk, and the biggest monthly loss was in July of 1943. Much in terms of, or let's say, net loss. So if you look at the number of operable fighter planes at the beginning of the month and at the end of the month, it's the biggest downturn is in July of 1943, and not in March, April, or May of 1944. So I just think that's an interesting fact and something that deserves more scrutiny. So I just want to know if you have any comment on that.
I probably do. So your numbers are just based on actual losses or the strength available at the Eastern Front?
Okay, so for the in terms of I'm talking about the global Luftwaffe fighter forces. Okay, so their largest decline in number overall, not just on the Eastern Front, came in July of 1943. Okay, I don't have I've spent a lot of time in the German archives. Beginning in September of 1943, going forward, there's really nice summaries by area: Eastern Front, Reich, West, South. You know, where the losses are. Unfortunately, they don't. I don't have that for. It only started in September 43. I do have other information, but it's like you have to go day by day, and I haven't had a chance to go through and collate all that information for July for the previous months before that, and I just downloaded that recently, and I haven't been able to go through it, but I do have some very interesting numbers on.
Yeah, this is interesting indeed. And you're talking about what time period? July or May as well? May, June?
Now that again has to do with the overall fighters. The first thing I was talking about is a different set of data, which relates to the individual Luftwaffe pilots that had 60 or more victories. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so I put in a database because that's what I do professionally, and I analyzed it, and I saw that the month with the highest number of losses amongst that cohort was July of 1943, which there were 11 killed in that month, of which 8 were on the Eastern Front and 3 were in Sicily, which actually is pretty good considering the size of it. But nevertheless, 8. That's bigger than any other month. You know, total globally for that 8 is bigger than any other month.
Okay.
So it's really it's kind of quite an accomplishment, especially given that. And I take it what you said is true. It conforms to what I understood. You know, the relatively low training standard and other problems in the VVS, but yet nevertheless they were able to shoot down quite a few.
So we can take a look at this together, okay? So because I do have the numbers of sorties and planes during that operation from the Soviet side. So it would be interesting to compare. What did they put on? What did they lose during that period of time? What was their fighter strength specifically? And it is a known fact that by 43, 44, eventually they eliminated the elite of the Luftwaffe. So the losses among the experts were quite substantial, and they could not recover because now the German Air Force, Germany is putting on the front line less experienced, still better trained pilots than the Russians did, but obviously in smaller numbers. And
yes, that's true.
That correlates with your numbers of high performing aces and losing them. We are also can talk about the intensity of action in terms of how intense the operation of Luftwaffe units was. How many sorties did they do, and how many Gruppen they still maintained in the Eastern Front and were maneuvering them along the front lines and concentrating them skillfully, by the way, while the Soviets had superior numbers, not necessarily concentrated and deployed. as efficiently. And once again, 43, we can say that roughly 10-1 losses ratio. Still pretty.
I'm glad you brought that up. You mentioned that ratio, and that was the 10-1 ratio was Luftwaffe versus VVS, basically, is what you're saying.
10 losses of VVS to 1 loss of Luftwaffe.
Yeah, that's incredible.
It is incredible. And I'm not talking fighter aviations, I'm talking overall, okay? Because a lot of Il-2s and bomber crews were lost significant losses.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, and I'm just looking. I just opened up another spreadsheet of mine, and going back to the number of the decrease in the number of operational ready single engine fighters. In July of 1943, it went down by almost 30% in 1 month. Okay, so let's jump forward to 1944. In let's see, March, it went down 2.6%. April, 6.2%. So much greater. And it's not because there are fewer being shot down, actually more are being shot down. But the part that the historiography misses completely is that the Luftwaffe's capacity to replace the losses has gone up by a considerable amount. Okay. It never was enough, but it's gone up. And that's the part that really doesn't get in the narrative. Okay. So up to that point, they were much more vulnerable. It basically was in the wake of the failure of Barbarossa, getting back to Barbarossa, that, the lights went on. And the Germans realized, hey, we've got a long war to go on. We can't, just like you said, Hitler ordered the
reduction.
Yeah. So, but of course, it's not like turning on a light bulb to start a aircraft production or to increase air. There's a lot of capacity. Basic investment has to be made, and so it took them a while. Plus, their biggest fuel crisis until after the middle of 44 was in the end of 42, and they didn't really have the fuel to even train fighter pilots. They were down to like 25 pilots a month coming out of school. They literally closed down 4 out of their 5 fighter pilot schools at the end of 1942. So, but in 43, they start building up their capacity. They start building up their fuel reserves because more synthetic fuel capacity is coming online, and and also because of they lost Italy as an ally, so they took all their reserves and they no longer had to allocate so much to Italy. So that was a boon to their Luftwaffe. Another aspect that's filtered out of the narrative. And so they just had it still was not great, but compared to what it was before, it was much greater capacity to greater resilience, to use the term, in early 1944 as they had before.
And actually it correlates with the numbers of increased density of enemy defenses. So that was something, because I mentioned the enemy defenses, the densities of artillery, of air defenses and so forth. But if you will add increased density of air assets, that also actually clicks quite well here.
You're talking about the density of on the German side or the Allied side, or
on the German side? Yeah, I was talking about the densities that I presented. They were densities on the German side, and that required increased capacity, increased numbers from the Soviets.
Right.
That was significant, like tens and in dozens, increasing of densities. Okay, so just to penetrate these defenses, now you need like significant increase of your numbers just to do what you have to do.
Very interesting.
These are interesting numbers indeed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Aaron, go on, Aaron.
Great. Thank you so much for a great talk, and thanks for organizing this, Jim. I had a question about the Far East. So another one of these sort of more obscure dimensions. But I'd like to know your opinion or your perspective on the speed that the Soviets had in deploying the 9th, 10th, and 12th Air Armies to the east as part of their I would say incredible campaign in terms of speed across Manchuria and their larger campaign that they were building towards, given that they moved, 20 basically their objective of moving, 20 armies across Eurasia, and their reliance on the air army power for reconnaissance, targeting, and for supporting combined arms. And if you can just, if you have anything to add to highlight that, or just anything from a perspective, given the incredible experience that those pilots already had, what they were bringing to that fight, in the Far East, relative to what the Japanese had ever seen.
Of course. So a couple of things. First of all, do you know how many air victories the Soviets achieved against the Japanese forces, the Japanese aviation during that campaign? Short campaign.
I have no idea. That's why I'm asking.
This was the main reason that we did not do a chapter on that in Red Phoenix Rising.
Okay.
Number is 6.
Gotcha.
6 victories in the air. So it's essentially nothing. What they did some strikes on ground targets or naval targets in the waters. And again,
well, my understanding is the main targeting they had was the rail network, and that was a big advantage that they had.
Secondly, they relied mostly on the pilots that were already there.
Okay.
It's not like shifting the air crews from the eastern frontier to the Far East. From the western.
Well, that was what I wanted to understand, is that
they obviously have had significant reserves accumulated in the Far Eastern theater.
Yeah, because given the conveyor belt coming of aircraft that the Russian pilots would fly from Alaska over the Far East, were they just stockpiling those pilots there?
By the way, I will talk about this in a few minutes.
Oh, great, thank you.
I love your question. Okay, I do have some interesting observations on that. And now I will tell you the story that I heard from a family friend some 40 years ago, who was the head of intelligence in one of the tank armor brigades in the Eastern Front. And in June 1945, they were put on the train as the entire unit and going back to the east and going back, and they realize this is way too far. It takes way too long. They were not even informed what is happening. So they realized that they are going from one slaughter to another. Literally, that was his quote. So what did they do? That's officers and enlisted men. So obviously they are bringing stuff from Germany, right? Like clothes and silk and, little things for families. They started to trade that with locals in this small train stations in Siberia, because they kind of, we are not coming back anyways.
Sure.
So when they arrived, they were rearmed completely from T-34s to brand new Sherman tanks, short period of familiarization, and march you go, okay? So by the time that they crossed Hingan Ridge, it was all over. So they didn't fire a shot. That is the story. I tend to believe him. Also from my sources, I have a very interesting article about the actions of Soviet strike aviations on Japanese targets. So they were kind of attacking some of the vessels, and the ship that they were attacking was essentially anti-aircraft ship. So obviously, you guys, you are all professionals, so you know how to do things like that, right? You suppress your anti-aircraft assets, and then you destroy the target. To my great surprise, I read that they sent PE-2 bombers from level flights, okay, first, and then Il-2s as ground attacks. Why not other way around, okay? And you send your Il-2s to suppress anti-aircraft fire, and then you put your main assets to destroy the target. It was other way around. Did they learn anything? Who was commanding this unit? So probably somebody who had no idea, who had no battle experience. So I hope I answered your question.
Oh no, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Wonderful
also,
talk.
now I will jump into this. So you're saying, you know, it's a conveyor belt of aircraft coming through Alaska-Siberian route. Let me elaborate on this. Over 4,000 or close to that, no, over 2,000 of P-63s, right? I have the numbers, of course, I just don't remember exact number right now. Over 1,000 plus of Spitfire 9s, which are considered high altitude assets. And this is 1944. And they are not being used against Germany. And they are accumulated in air defense units to protect Leningrad, Moscow, and the oil industry of Baku. Air defense against whom? The Germans cannot reach these targets anymore. So you tell me, Stalin is collecting high altitude interceptors, essentially. Against what?
He's doing his pre-deterrence preparations.
Exactly. Okay, so he is getting ready, because there is nothing else in the inventory that could actually counteract the B-17s and 24s and so forth. Okay, so they never publicized that. So, well, they were using this for training and conversion training. Yeah, tell me about it. I don't believe it. You don't need thousands of them, right?
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Aaron. Let me go to Mike.
Thank you.
Hello? Just call on me, Jim?
Yeah, go on, Mike.
Well, first of all, just to start over the point of information, when we're talking about, when Gary was talking about the Luftwaffe pilots killed, you have to remember that that in the West, German pilots were flying over their own, either over Germany or German-controlled territory. So if they bailed out, they could be shot down. But if they bailed out, they weren't going to disappear. They could be returned to duty. So that might be one factor involved in that. Also, the production of in 1943, the Germans turned exclusively to the production of fighter aircraft, and subsequent to that, towards the end of the war, when actually fighter aircraft increased, the quality of the aircraft was going down. That may be due to operating under a totalitarian government where somebody says, I want you to increase the amount of fighters produced, even regardless of whether or not you have the industrial capacity to do so. So not wanting to get on bad terms with your totalitarian superiors, you produce lower quality aircraft, which will be not as operational, if operational at all. I don't know if that helps for that discussion. My question for you, Ilya, is that it's actually two. One main question was that in the Soviet Air Force, what was the quality, especially further on the war, along in the war, because you talk about poor training, and of course, a lot of the poor training is because there wasn't enough fuel, there weren't enough supplies in order to do that. But as far as classroom training, which of course is not as good as operational training, but as far as training navigators, well, even pilots, what was the quality of the classroom training, or the amount of time given to classroom training, which was pretty extensive in the United States and Britain and Canada? So if you could address that. And also another question I had is that with the, I mean, I would imagine the Soviet Air Force basically left strategic bombing to the Western allies, meaning the United States and Britain. But
I would say unwittingly.
Yeah, right. But with Germany, yes, they could say by the time after the Battle of Britain, Germany could say they didn't need a strategic bomber because they couldn't hit the main production facilities for the Allies, which were in the United States and Canada. But the Germans did have the possibility of being able to hit at least some Soviet industrial centers.
Which they did, by the way, as I said.
But why wouldn't they have constructed, and they always knew, I mean, even before the war officially started, there was always the feeling in the Nazi high command that they were probably going to attack the Soviet Union. That was one of their mortal enemies. So why weren't they planning a strategic bomber for attacks against Soviet industry?
So I will start with training, first of all. So I do not have the numbers of class hours right now in front of me, but in the orders from the People's Commissar of Defense, the training was allocated for pilots and navigators. 2 years during the peacetime, 1 year during the wartime. So these are orders from 1940, 1939, okay? With a number of hours of 150 hours of training overall. And that means both classroom training and in-flight training. Reduced to 75 hours in the wartime. The fact is 20, far short of 75. You can compare that with the number of hours for the Americans. It's huge difference, okay? Now, speaking of developing of strategic assets for Luftwaffe, they did have some designs, and I believe Craig touched that last time, but they did not really take off in terms of production. They did have a couple of items. First of all, it's extremely expensive. It takes time and resources that Germany was lacking at that time. Okay, the most, once again, it's a doctrinal thing, like the ground forces take it all. And as I don't remember who said that, I think also Craig that, you know, for Tirpitz battleship. So if they wouldn't build Tirpitz, they could use the steel for 2,000 tanks. So now it's pretty much an analogous to building a strategic bomber. So instead of one strategic bomber, you can put like 20, 30 medium bombers or 40, maybe 50 of fighter aircraft that are necessary. And by the way, speaking of technical characteristics, so now they are building only fighters, but don't forget the ground attack version of Focke-Wulf 190, which can carry 1,000-pound bomb. Now you have a single engine derivative of a fighter aircraft with a payload that exceeds the 2-engine frontal bomber that the Soviet had. So you see, the allocation of resources, the cost versus effectiveness, I believe that had some calculus in that as well. So why would you waste your resources? It's pretty incredible. And now again, speaking of the strategic bomber, I would say in the end of 30s, when the top Soviet designers, including Tupolev and his crew, were imprisoned by the secret police, by NKVD, and were working in captivity. So they organized the design bureau essentially under the auspices of secret police. And the condition for their release was the plane flies, you go free. Okay? And Tupolev was tasked to design and build 4-engine heavy bomber, dive bomber. Right.
A 4-engine dive bomber.
4-engine dive bomber with the main target of the Royal Navy. Because at that time, the Soviets thought that Britain is the main adversary. Everybody was an adversary, but they put their money on on the British. So of course that was not possible. That was impossible task. And then, they realized, Stalin and Beria, under whose command this design bureau was actually operating, so they changed the task. So, there is no need for 4-engine dive bomber, because now the enemy would not be England, it might be Germany. So now we need 2-engine bomb, dive bomb. So that was the birth of Tu-2, Tupolev Tu-2. Okay. So once again, strategic priorities, the capability and capacity of the national economy. I would say that dictates what you can do, what you cannot do. So the United States, unlimited resources, essentially. They could afford that. They could do. They had the know-how, they had the capacity, and they had the will.
Amazing. Go on, Frank. And let me just add, we've had Ilya on now for several hours. So if anybody wants to get their licks in, raise your hand. Go on, Frank.
Okay. These are just questions that concern me. It's because they don't make any sense. You'd say that the Soviet Union didn't embark upon a strategic bombing stratagem, right? Mm-hmm. And yet Swedish oil was right next to them, didn't bother with that, allowed that to go unimpeded. U-boats were being trained, from basically novices to fairly functional in the Baltic. They didn't touch that. And as I mentioned before, they didn't touch some of the more sophisticated plants that were being developed, like, those under tank, or the Fokker Wolf, I think. And they captured, cleverly, the V2 test sites in Poland. Didn't share that. Well, they shared a little bit. That led to their Sputnik program very nicely, thanks to paperclip and all that. So you've got some odd decisions by Stalin that seem to actually work against the Allies. And you've mentioned it one or two already.
Yeah.
So I think that needs clarification at some point in the future. I don't think we're going to get it out of their archives. So, and one other point, the Würzburg radar if you look at the three main developments out of the United States, the B-29, the Manhattan Project, and radar, these are extremely expensive. And in terms of defense budget, the Würzburg radar must have been massively expensive. But it was everything that was massively expensive, like the V2 and the V1 and the ME-262, all that was deployed against the West. So I think it's underappreciated just how much of the German defense budget was actually not employed on the Eastern Front. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I have a comment on that. I'm just reading a wonderful book, which is called Roosevelt and His Centurions. And there is a good point in that Stalin was not, faithful and straightforward with the Allies. No, they had their own interests, okay? But Allies also had their own interests to keep the Soviet Union at war, whatever it takes. The problem is, did they share? No. Larry Bell sent his representatives to the Soviet Union to find out, what can be improved and how things are actually being deployed properly. Not very efficient. The extent that they brought this technical team from Bell was to the reserve training unit, okay, not to the front unit. Then, clearly, as I mentioned, they were already accumulating high-level interceptors. We kind of can guess about the reasons. Now they are getting their hands on the German technology that they capture at the final months of the war, likewise as Americans do. Of course, they would not share. Do we like this or not? I don't like that idea. They would take everything and giving not much in return. What else? I just lost my thread. You asked something else, and I want you to elaborate on that.
Oh, the Würzburg radar, maybe? Or no? It was a defense budget. The German defense budget seems to be more.
Okay. Now we are talking about defense budget, and we are talking about long-range strategic bombing assets. So in 1930s, the Soviet built quite large quantities of TB3, Tupolev TB3 bombers, quite significant investment. And in very short few years, it became totally obsolete. Huge expenses from the budget. In fact, when the military were asking for more, Stalin said, "You are bankrupting the country. We cannot afford that. So temper down your desires." Okay? And finally, they built the more or less modern four-engine bomber, BE-8. But they could not afford more than they had. Okay? So they just stopped production. They actually concentrated them in one or two regiments and one division of long-range aviation. And that was it. The tactics, the operational implementation or utilization of these heavy bombers was pretty much the same as other two-engine long-range bombers that, essentially would not have the punch necessary to do any damage. It was mostly mosquito bites. Do you realize that most, if not all, of the B-25s, which is considered medium bomber, they were utilized in long-range aviation. They were taking from the air forces and concentrating and deployed in long-range aviation for night missions quite successfully, changing the flight profile just to get the range. But once again, on the night bombing, not in large formations, it's like a stream of one after one after one. It's completely different utilization of these assets. So first of all, that's the lack of the doctrine, the lack of understanding how to use strategic aviation, the budgetary constraints, the manufacturing constraints. You do not have the industrial base to do that. By the way, pretty significant number of Il-2s, when they switched from all wooden wings to metal aluminum wings in 43-ish, in more or less bigger numbers. Just the airframes that are being found as wrecks, they look at the skin, aluminum skin, with the stamp L-clad, made in USA. Okay? So the lack of materials, the lack of metals, it was all Lend-Lease supplied. Machining tools for all metal airplanes were Lend-Lease. So the entire Factory 22 that was building PE-2s, that was all equipped with American machinery, machine tools. So now tell me, how would you deploy and build strategic assets in large quantities that will make a difference if you do not have the capability? And for Germany, obviously, this is, again, limited resources and doctrinal things. What do we do now? Where would we concentrate our forces? Obviously, armor, tanks, panzers, okay? That's where the resources are going. Artillery, ground war, pretty much. And now, fairly limited number of air assets, skillful organization, skillful deployment, concentration, ability to move them quickly. Even basing requirements, okay? Like Luftwaffe ground crews would be moved on Junkers 52s very quickly, if not before the main forces will be deployed to the airfield. So maneuver of forces, very skillful. Concentration of forces, command and control, rehearsed quite well and studied quite well to mastery. So that's what it was.
Wow, thank you so much. What an explanation. Go on, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very, very interesting. I think somewhere midway you talked about the General Novikov and the radios, and that improved the horrible command and somewhat anyway, the horrible command and control of the Red Air Force. I'm curious, to what extent was that accomplished with American manufactured radios, or did the Russians manufacture their own radios?
Well, first of all, the quality is the decisive factor. The range, the manufacturing capabilities. I do have numbers of how many radio stations were supplied. I don't know if I have numbers of how many were produced, but whatever was produced by the Soviets, for the ground forces mostly on a tactical level, if we are talking about like communications in terms of command and control for larger formations at the corps or army level, that was definitely mostly Lend-Lease. For air forces, mostly Lend-Lease. Now, in combination of longer range radio, high quality, well designed, and also installed on the aircraft. So now you have communication capabilities, but you also have to provide training, how to use it properly. because in the air you are pretty much on one channel, and the chatter and the swearing and the screaming, how to distinguish who is screaming, who is asking for assistance. If there is just constant, constant noise, so it's very high. So in some cases, P-39 will come with, I believe, 2 or 3 radio sets, different stations. So they will remove 1 or 2 of them and use elsewhere because they didn't have enough of their own. So they thought, okay, 1 is enough, so I will take another one. We'll use it elsewhere. Like P-39Q came with 50 caliber machine guns under the wings in the pods. So they removed them. They never used them in operations. They removed them because they needed them elsewhere.
Okay, so mostly Lend-Lease then, just like
Yes,
the ground forces.
I would say so, yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Gary, you had your hand up and put it down. Did you want to jump in there before Ted? Gary?
Well, I already went, so Ted should go first, don't you think?
That's all right. Your hand was up ahead of him. Go on.
Well, I mean, I just want to make a little comment about it just blows me away that the myth of the utility of the big bomber just will not die. And to say that the Germans would have substantially increased their war potential by having a big bomber. First of all, they didn't have enough fuel to do that. As I just mentioned, they couldn't even, towards the end of 42, they couldn't even train up fighter pilots because of lack of fuel. And not surprisingly, I can't remember who it was. One of the German top Luftwaffe officers after the war, I recently read, made the same point. We did not have enough fuel to sustain a 4-engine bomber program on any scale. So what's the point? And based on this presentation, I guess there was a limitation of fuel for training in the Red Air Force, the VVS. So I would think the same. It takes a lot of fuel to run a 4-engine bomber.
Absolutely, you're totally right. Absolutely, I like that.
And here's the other thing. You're talking about the allocate. We just heard about the allocation of resources to radar. There was a recent study done about Bomber Command. 5%, not 5% of that Bomber Command took up. I'm not talking 5% of the armaments budget of Great Britain, 5% of the war budget of Great Britain, 5% of the government budget of Great Britain. No, 5% of the GDP of Great Britain went into Bomber Command. That is a staggering figure, especially for the minimal results they got for most of the war. Up until, yes, at the end of the war, there were some
results.
Huh?
They did not expect it to be minimal results.
And they expect to be war winning.
Right. So
and
that's
so it's an incredible investment. Yes, towards the end, they got some good results, and I'm not going to deny that. But up through the end of the Battle of Normandy, and I would say after which you would have to say that there's definitely no doubt that Germany's going to lose. So the amount of investment that went into, and of course it was a huge investment of American resources too, but we had so many resources we could afford to be wasteful. But I just don't see why we can't see in retrospect. It's okay. I'll grant at the time it seemed like a great idea. We're going to win this war on the cheap. We're going to have these new technology bombers. They're going to go in there and knock out the other side's critical industries, and we're going to bomb them to the morale out of them, and they'll just give up. It's a great idea, but it's fine for people to be wrong about it prospectively, but we just can't give up on it retrospectively. So anyway, that's all. That's my 2 cents.
And on this item, I would refer you all to a wonderful book by R.J. Overy, the bombers and the bombed. It speaks about all these aspects on both sides. Okay, and how inefficient the bombing, especially 41 by RAF was. So they actually bombed just the fields, far away from any meaningful target. Far away.
And the reaction was like, hey, maybe we should adjust our strategy because this isn't working. It's like, no, we've got to make it work. No matter what, we've got to make this work, even though all the evidence is saying it's not working. And to give them credit, they did increase their bombing actually quite a bit, and there were improvements made. But you could have, at that decision point, say, you know what, this is this huge investment, and they just kept asking the bomber, the top portal and the rest wanted to get to 4,000 heavy bombers, which they never did get that many. Well, if we just get to 4,000, well, it's like, how much more resources do you want? It's like almost a religion. No matter what the evidence against it, there's always going to be something. We have, my friend Mike here, basically, if the statistics go against them, well, the statistics are phony.
Well, Frank, there's
no disproving it because it's religious.
I love these conversations and questions because it just prompts like the different line of thinking. Okay, so you put huge amount of investment, like as you said, 5% of GDP in creating a bomber force that is fairly inefficient, apparently. And how would you substitute what you do not do with these resources? And the answer is Lend-Lease. Americans took the tab, okay, to pay for the needs of the United Kingdom, okay, of what they could invest in their own defense and their own war production. And then misappropriated these resources, okay? And then the United States is actually supplying what they could do by themselves, okay? So it's...
But even when it comes to Lend-Lease, we're giving 5 or 6 times as much to Great Britain as we are who is not using it. They're just stockpiling it. It's crazy. 17,000 Sherman tanks. 17,000. They never used anywhere close to that many. And so there's always this narrative, and it's not like I have any sympathy for the Soviet regime or Stalin or any of those things. Quite the contrary. But there's this narrative, oh my God, they benefited so much from Lend-Lease. What about Great Britain? They got 5 or 6 times as much. And what did they do with it? At least if you gave it to the Soviet Union, they were going to use it
Frank,
right away, pretty much.
Frank, are you familiar with my site on Lend-Lease?
No, I might have run across it, not known as yours, but
yeah, that's fine. Lendlease.net, land-lease.net, okay? And I published the full document by the War Department that was released in 1946, I think, I'm not sure, listing everything that was supplied by the United States to all countries recipients of Lend-Lease, okay? There are some errors, obviously, but generally speaking, this is very, very interesting document. I just scanned it as it is, okay, and published that.
I want to thank you for promoting this presentation. My field is Japanese history and the war in the Pacific. And so the name of your Lend-Lease site was lendlease.net. That's it?
Yes, land-lease.net, yes.
Lend-Lease, lend-lease. Okay, thank you. No, first of all, I want to say...
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you very much. No, extraordinarily interesting program. And of course, one of the issues I've been dealing with for years and years is trying to find out what came to the Far East and ended up in the Far East, and what ended up and then was used against the Japanese or became the basis for the Soviet position in the Far East after the war. But I also want to just mention, this is an aside, the reason I wanted to get in this conversation just for a moment, is for the Japanese in the pre-1930s, mid-30s on, the greatest threat to their national security, besides the U.S. Navy, which was theoretically out there, and they built their Navy against the U.S. Navy, was the fear of Soviet bombing. and it's in all the children's magazines, all the young men's magazines, all the defense documents, the fear and many of the civilian arguments against the war. In fact, I'm writing about this now. In one chapter in my book is about the way in which cities like Osaka were terrified of Soviet bombing reaching Japan. Of course, the problem was the Soviets have the planes at that time to do that, but they were afraid of those big 4-engine bombers, theoretically, or the ones you saw on the magazine covers. So I just want to pass that along. And I wonder if you had any thought that the Soviets had ever come up with a document to attack Japan by air in the mid or late 30s. Do you know anything about that by any chance?
Nothing that I heard about that. Not at all. I think that
the Japanese used it all the time as a primary way to mobilize, but they were always denied, the military, particularly the Navy, always denied that they would ever be attacked by air, because they would shoot them. It would be impossible. And so they argued against it, but it was a popular sentiment based on the level of air war, going back to maybe what Gary just said, the idea that the air war was a way to be defended against. You had to defend against this, and it was very expensive to defend it. Of course, we could say that about the Germans. How many 100,000 or tens of thousands of anti-aircraft guns could have been used on the Eastern Front if they hadn't been defending against strategic bombers.
Obviously, the lack of resources, the lack of materials, the lack of fuel, as Frank said, that's a good point. And
well, thank you. I just wanted to get
the main strategy of Stalin was just keep them at peace, don't provoke them, don't allow for the second front stabbing them in the back at the critical points. So that was pretty.
You mentioned the overrunning of Manchuria in 1945, and of course, and you mentioned how few planes. I've interviewed a number of the pilots who were fleeing as fast as they could out of the way of the Russian offensive, and also one of my people in my Japan at War book was one of the men who was sitting on the Russian frontier, ready to bomb Vladivostok. He was in charge of the air forces when the war in the South began in December 1941. He thought he was going against Russia, and so it's an interesting project. Thank you very much for your.
Thank you.
To answer some of the points there. First of all, you can look. Everybody's got their own set of facts and figures. If you don't look at all of them, if you don't look at both sides, you're going to come to a more, shall we say, extreme or less informed, obviously less informed conclusion. As far as the bombing goes, I've looked at both sides. And people who were saying Bob was totally ineffective, and people who were saying it was a war-winning strategy, and everything in between. And I've come to the conclusion that the bombing was that the Allied bombing was highly effective. If I can just, forgetting even about the U.S. daylight precision bombing, which was more effective than the RAF's area bombing, in my assessment. But even so, if you look at the RAF bombing of Peenemünde in 1943, it delayed the use of the German V-1 and possibly to an extent the V-2 weapons. And in war, delay is vitally important as well. People sometimes look at it and say, oh, it didn't permanently destroy this, or they rebuilt this. Of course they rebuilt it. But delay is important as well. Also, as far as the figures being wrong, Gary, I can tell you what I was saying is that you can't always believe. This is just from my training as an investigative reporter. You can't always just take figures at face value. You have to look deeper into them. I think some of the financial crises we've had, if you look at the scandals that we've had, if you just take the figures that people give you, that usually isn't enough. And in the Nazi regime, sometimes, not all the times, those figures would be fudged at the very least. But anyway, and as far as Lend-Lease goes, well, it's kind of obvious. First of all, the British did do something with the Sherman tank, which is putting a 17-pounder on it, the Firefly, which was more advanced than what the U.S. was doing. But even so, just looking at it from a political sense, of course you're going to give more lend-lease to the ally that you trust more. I don't think the United States, and certainly not Great Britain, ever totally trusted the Stalin regime.
Not at all.
And therefore, of course, you're going to give your lend-lease to those people who are going to use it in a way that's mutually beneficial to you and that ally.
That's not my point, Mike. And I agree with you on that, but that's not my point. My point is not that they shouldn't have given more to a more trustworthy ally. I'm all in favor of that. Matter of fact, I think we should have given less to the, so at some point we should have cut them off. But that's not the point. The point is what people say about, oh, well, you know, the Soviet Union could have never done what they did. They might even have lost the war if it hadn't been for lend-lease and that sort of thing. And so I'm just balancing that against what we gave to Great Britain. And I didn't say they didn't use, of course they used Sherman tanks. I'm just saying they didn't use a fraction of what we gave them.
They used more than a fraction of it, Gary. I mean, in other words,
well, you come up with the numbers. Where they did not use 17,000 Sherman tanks during the war. I guarantee you.
But they didn't use like 1% of those either.
We only sent by November of 1943, we'd only sent like 200 and some odd Sherman tanks to the Soviet Union.
Right.
And thousands. And I don't even want to even complain about the British themselves. We're even worse. By the end of 1942, we'd produced 8,000 Sherman tanks. That's more than both sides of the Battle of Kursk combined. And yet, it was July of 1944 was the first time that the United States, the arsenal of democracy, creating all these tanks that even had more than one armored division in contact with the enemy.
But
it's staggering if you consider that.
Gary, you're looking at it, your Monday morning quarterbacking. As Ilya pointed out, at that time, they didn't know how much they would need. We overproduce. You could say we overproduced, but we didn't overproduce from the standpoint of that time. From that time, we had no idea. As it turned out, the Sherman tank wasn't as effective as the Panther or Tiger. But the point I wanted to make to Ilya, since this is who we're supposed to be dealing with and what we're supposed to be dealing with, is
I will make a comment on that, Mike and Gary. It's the same situation as I mentioned for every German bomber or fighter. Okay, the Russians had to put 3 or 4 more to meet the performance and to meet the output. Same thing with Shermans. So how many Shermans would be equivalent to one Tiger to defeat it? Because you have to surround it and shoot it from different places, okay, essentially. So the numbers are sometimes deceiving. It's the function and how the numbers are correlated with the function. Mike, I do appreciate your mentioning of delaying. I think this is very important. And I'm also always having a position for many years that each side alone would not win that war. If it would be no lend-lease, if it would be no allied help, would the Russians win the war? Yes, they had enough people to put and to sacrifice. It would be another 5 or 10 million. How much longer the war would last? Another 2 or 3 years? Is there a guarantee that the Germans will not develop a nuclear weapon during that time? So the action delayed, right?
Yes.
That's the point. Only together it could be done, not one side without the other.
All right, thank you, Michael. Just quickly on strategic bombing, I just think it's really interesting. Just talking about earlier people were saying about how it didn't work and thinking about in the 1930s, strategic bombing was seen kind of in the way I think nuclear war was seen post-war in terms of the devastation of strategic bombing. And it just never really had the impact that, was kind of predicted. Thinking about the Blitz, for example, when, London was attacked and actually it didn't force a British surrender. And also Dresden and Hamburg and the strategic bomb raids on Germany that again didn't bring about the surrender. And I think, that stat of 5% GDP was mentioned by Gary, it's really interesting. And it never really had the impact intended. And I think, there is a school of thought that Dresden and those raids were actually more designed to show the Soviet Union post-war, the capabilities that the USAF and the RAF had if there was to be a sort of hot conflict rather than a Cold War. And I think Arthur Harris in the RAF still to his dying day maintained that strategic bombing could have won the war. D-Day wasn't necessary and 5% of GDP wasn't enough. And if it just been funded correctly, it could have brought about a German surrender. And, I just don't think it's ever really, advocates of air power say that it could bring about the end of a conflict, but it's just never really done it. And just finally, I think even today in the Ukraine conflict, Russia is still bombing civilian areas as part of their military campaign. So it's still going on to the present day, despite all the evidence to the contrary that whatever the moral considerations of it, militarily, it's just not an effective strategy and it doesn't bring about an end to a conflict. So yeah, I just wanted to share those thoughts. I thought that was really interesting. And thank you again, Jim, for organizing this. And thank you, Professor. Really interesting. Yeah, I really enjoyed this talk.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yes.
I like how we actually we moved to more strategic aspects, not just June 22nd. Okay, I like that a lot.
Right. Yeah, no, I knew that would happen. And also, it's funny because Michael made a comment about the need to explain other points of view when you're trying to understand things. That was what went through my mind when I went into the Gaza encampment in front of Butler Library at Columbia University yesterday. And also, as I'm listening to this discussion, Frank, you will have the last word. I'm thinking of all the times I went through the strategic bombing series. And I remember the first time I ever encountered that massive tome and started to go through it. And then, of course, we question today what we read in it. And it raises all sorts of interesting questions. But go on, Frank, you have the last word.
Yeah, this is about strategic bombing as well. Let's imagine putting all those flak batteries on the Eastern Front, okay? Because if there wasn't a strategic bombing campaign by the United States and Britain, or why not just imagine what it would have been like had they actually concentrated on the oil production, which they were doing towards the end of the war. And the other thing is that the most important asset of Germany was not its actual manufacturing. It was the manufacturers. In other words, their engineers. Their major asset were their workers. And one of the reasons why Harris and Churchill were talking about bombing the last 13 towns in the east before the Soviets got there was obviously to get them out, get all these workers out and head them west, which they eventually did. Because yes, there was a concept of the need to think about Stalin after the war. So, one other thing, 9,000 V2s were built. Okay, now you put a fully fueled V2, it's probably as much as a Tiger tank. They only made a 1,700 Tiger tanks, so imagine that. So yeah, you can look at strategic bombing from many angles, but to say that it was a waste of time is, I think it is another front, no question about it. So that's my thoughts.
All right. Well, and again, to take it to the present, I think of the situation we're watching right now, in the sense of using air power to deal with a complicated political situation emanating from October 7th. And the articles that have appeared about the impact of artificial intelligence on targeting done by the Israeli Air Force in Gaza, which, again, the assumption of bombing is along the lines, if you will. It reminds me of what people thought they would achieve going back even today with using air power to essentially terrorize the population into political submission, which is, again, something that's always controversial with the use of strategic air power. Well, first of all, Ilya, I want to thank you so much. It was really, really, really illuminating today. And I guess one thing that comes out of this and listening to you talk is I'm saying to myself, well, maybe Ilya has an idea about the question of the actual technical aspects about Soviet air production in World War II. That is the factory problems, the tool machine problems, the interrelationship that you raised earlier with the issue of astounding figure 80, that huge number of aircraft lost to non-combat losses, which are interrelated to the overall question of the lack of fuel to be used for all sorts of different purposes, all sorts of interesting questions that relate to the overall war economy of the Soviet Union during World War II. Absolutely fascinating. And plus the post-Soviet developments after World War II. And just as I was listening to you talk, I said, "Wow, like how are they learning from these lessons?" And of course, you did that with a really interesting discussion about the machine copying of the B-29 that gives them their first strategic bomber. But it just raises all sorts of questions about how they're projecting them, sort of like the ones alive, what David Holloway did when he did his amazing book Stalin and the Bomb. And I had the great pleasure to listen to him at Stanford about 30 years ago. But I wanted to thank you so much, Ilya. I hope we can, think of some other topics for you to, pick your vast brain of down the road. It was really, really, really amazing to listen to you get into that level of detail on the Red Air Force. And I know all of us enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you so
Thanks. Good night, all.
much. All right. Thank you.